Okay, let's get started. Um, this is part 13 in our ongoing series on the fourth chapter of Bava Metzia. And we are continuing our discussion that we began, I think we began it last week, about a dispute between Rav and Shmuel about what the Mishnah means when it says that overcharging by a sixth is ona'ah. Okay, so everybody seems to share some background assumptions. So let's make them explicit, and then we'll see where they disagree. Whatever ona'ah is, whatever a sixth is, whatever ona'ah is, which according to everybody except Rabbi Tarfon, is a sixth of something. At that price, the customer or the seller, whoever it is that didn't get what they were supposed to get, we're going to call that person the victim for convenience sake, has the right until some sort of deadline, which we will see more about that deadline, to go back to the other party in the transaction and demand at their own discretion either that money change hands until the price was the right price, or that the whole transaction get reversed, they trade back and start over again. If the overcharge was less than ona'ah, then whatever you think that six is, at numbers that are less than that, more than the regular price, the presumption is that the the victim forgives the extra money. That is to say that they just sort of understand that prices are never going to be exactly right, and they don't mind. The customer doesn't mind overpaying a little bit, or the seller doesn't mind undercharging a little bit. We will investigate whether that's automatic or whether they have some period of time in which to reject that situation. But that everybody assumes that the normal case is that at less than a sixth, closer to the price than a sixth, the aggrieved party would just say, "Oh, never mind, whatever," and move on, and they wouldn't try to fix it. At more than ona'ah, whatever you think that ona'ah is a sixth of, if the overcharge is more than that, or the undercharge is great by more money than that, which is less, but whatever. If the problem is more than a sixth, then that's what we call a canceled transaction, and the transaction is as if it didn't happen. Everybody has to give the stuff back to the person they started with and start over again. Although, again, we will see a discussion about whether there's a time limit on how long you have to make that happen, or whether you can come back 5 years later and say, "Hey, by the way, you charged me twice as much as you should have for this book. I want my money back." We'll talk about that. In the middle, we have this central number that the Mishnah calls a sixth of the purchase. And Rav thinks that that is always exactly a sixth of the correct price. And remember, everybody has their background assumption that there is a correct price for every object. Well, we're not going to challenge that. And it may very well be that that's legal fiction, or it may very well be that their culture is different than ours in a way that makes that make sense. Whatever it is, it is in the background, and we're just going to have to leave it. But Rav says that this 1/6, that's where you have a choice, where the victim has a choice whether to reverse the transaction or whether to fix the price, that is 1/6 of the correct price, meaning the thing was supposed to cost 30, and you charged him 35 for it, right? 30 divided by 6 is 5. Yes. Okay. So it was supposed to cost 30 and you charged him 35. Or it was supposed to cost 30 and you only paid him 25. Either one. That's Rav. Shmuel says, yes, obviously those are cases of a sixth, but there's another set of cases that are also cases of a sixth, and those are cases in which the it's a sixth of the actual paid price, meaning you paid 30, but it was supposed to have only cost 25. It was supposed to have cost 5/6 of what you paid. Or you paid 30 and it was really supposed to have cost 36. Now, the problem is that, as we noted last week, because the laws are different above this number than below it, and Shmuel has two different numbers that count as that number, the space in between those numbers is problematic, right? At exactly 35 instead of 30, Shmuel says, yep, that's ona'ah. Less than that is forgiven. More than that is canceled. At exactly 36 for a 30, for something that was supposed to cost 30. Shmuel also says, yep, that's ona'ah. Less than that is forgiven, and more than that is canceled. The problem is that 35 and 36 are a whole dollar apart. What happens if I paid 35 and a half for something that was supposed to cost 30? So it turns out, I did not do the research on this myself. I sent my husband, who is much better at this kind of thing than I am. He came back and reported all possible options exist. There are people who think that in between 30 and 35 and 36, it's just forgiven. There are people who think that between 35 and 36, it's canceled. And my favorite, which is apparently the Magid Mishnah, is that between 35 and 36 is as if it was 35 or 36. Shmuel just thinks it's a range from 5/6 up to 6/7. From 6/5 up to 7/6. That range is going to be treated as onah. Okay, that was all last week. We are sort of still trying to figure out if we can find a way to prove either Shmuel or Rav right or wrong. I will tell you now that we are not in the end going to be able to prove anybody right or wrong. We're just going to discover that some texts work better with one and some texts work better with the other, and they both seem to have a solid basis in the tradition. Okay, so here we are. Tonight. So this is a quote from our Mishnah that we saw last week or the week before. Ha'ona'ah daled kesef me'esrim v'arba'a kesef laseh l'shtut lamika. This is our source text. Ona'ah is 4 silvers out of 24 silvers. And 24 silvers is a coin called a sela. And 4 out of 24 is a sixth of the purchase. So the Gemara says, "My loved dizavin shave esrim be'esrim ve'arba." So the Gemara says, doesn't that mean that he sold something that's worth 20 for 24? Meaning he's overcharging by what we would call a fifth of the correct price. Right? 4 out of 20 is a fifth. Which is the same as a sixth of what the actual paid price. That would be Shmuel. So isn't that what it means? Ushma mina shtut ma'ot nami shaninu, and that would teach us that Shmuel is right, that it's also teaching about a sixth of the actual price. No, the Mishnah can't work that way. Dizavin shave esrim va'arba be'esrim. Now, it actually means, or at least Rav is going to assume that it actually means, that he sold something that's worth 20 for 24. Worth 24 for 20. I got that backwards. Okay. In that case, if you sell something for less than it's worth, right, it's worth 24 and you sell it for 20, then minit aneh, who is the victim there? Mocher, the seller, right? If you sell something for less than it's worth, the person being cheated is the seller. So in that case, we're going to have a problem, because having the seller be the victim is not going to work all the way through the Mishnah. Ema Seifa, let's look at the end. Ad matai mutar lahachzir, until when is it permitted to return it? Kadesha yar'eh latagar o lakrovo. You have long enough to show it to a merchant or to your relative. Now, that sounds like we're talking about showing the object that you bought to somebody to find out how much it was supposed to cost. And that sounds like something that the customer would do. So if the Mishnah is talking about the same case all the way through, it does not make sense for it to be only talking about the seller. The Amar Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman said, Lo shanu ela lokeach, aval mocher leolam choser. And what's more, not only does the wording of the Mishnah sound like it's talking about a customer, but it's worse, because the law that the Mishnah said, which is that you only have, as a time span in which to complain, you only have long enough to go show it to somebody. Rav Nachman says that's only the buyer. But a seller, if a seller discovers that they've been cheated, there's no time limit on how long they can go back and insist on being made whole. So it must be Ella Dizavein Shave Esrim V'Arba Ve'Esrim Utmanya. It must be that we're, one second, let me translate this, John, and then I will call on you. It must be that we're saying that we had something that was worth 24, and he sold it for 28, meaning it was a sixth of the correct price, but the person being cheated is the customer. Yes, John.
Trouble understanding how the seller, who now presumably no longer has the item, can show it to anyone to find out that he got a wrong price.
Right. So that's one of the reasons that we know the Mishnah has to be talking about a buyer. That, and the fact that Rav Nachman says that the time limit that the Mishnah imposes wouldn't be true for a seller. Right. Is it? Yes, that is correct. And so the Mishnah has to be talking about the buyer, not the seller. Okay, so we decide that in fact it works like, or at least it can be read to work like Rav, which is to say that the 1/6 is a sixth of the correct price, but and still read it that the victim in the Mishnah is the buyer, so that the second clause of the Mishnah still fits. Okay, moving on to see if we can prove something from the next part of our Mishnah. Tanan, Rabbi Tarfon Bilod. So you might remember that our Mishnah ended with this weird story about Rabbi Tarfon in the city of Lod, where he had ruled that that ona'ah is actually not a sixth, it's a third. So he said, ona'ah shmona kesef me'esrim v'arba kesef. He said ona'ah is 8 silvers out of 24 silvers. From a sella is 24 silvers. Shlish lamikach, which is a third of the purchase. So maybe we can prove something about whether it's Rav or Shmuel from this Rabbi Tarfon. My love dizavein shave shitzere be'esrim v'arba. So doesn't that mean that we're selling something worth 16 for 24? Right. So then if there's a third happening there, it's a third of the final price. Right. It's actually, you're overpaying by half of the original price. If that were the case, ushma mina shlishma nami shaninu, in which case it would be the case that we were talking, that the Mishnah is also talking about a third of the actual price. No, we don't have to read it that way. Lo zavein shave esrim arba b'shitzar. No, it means he sold something that was worth 24 for 16. You might notice this is exactly the same conversation we just had, with the numbers adjusted to make the fraction a third instead of a sixth. Otherwise, it's exactly the same logic, same order, same everything. We're going to say that it's the a third of the correct price, and it means that he undercharged. He charged 16 for something that was worth 24. In which case, minit aneh mocher. In which case, who's the victim there? The victim is the seller. But that's not going to work because Ema Seifa, if we keep going in the Rabbi Tarfon story, at the end it says, Amar Lahem, he told them, Kol Hayom Mutar Lachzor, told them the deadline for returning and demanding to reverse the transaction or to fix the price is the whole day. Which you may recall, at that point, the merchants say, well, in that case, never mind, we don't like you, Rabbi Tarfon, go away and leave us alone. And they rehire the other rabbis as their town rabbi, and they go back to keeping the halacha that we had at the beginning of the Mishnah with a sixth, and just until you have time to show it to people. Okay, so we have here a limit on how long you can return it. And Rav Nachman said, and now we actually need Rav Nachman here because unlike before, it doesn't actually say anything about showing the merchandise to somebody. So this could just as easily be talking about the seller. But Rav Nachman said, Lo shanu ela lokeach aval mocher leolam chozer. So Rav Nachman said the Mishnah is only limiting the time of the customer. The seller has, as long as he wants, has forever to go back. So, at least according to Rav Nachman, we have to here be talking about the customer, because the customer is the one who has a limit on how long he can go back. Yes, John.
Let's imagine the seller sold some diamonds to the buyer.
Mhm.
And after the sale, the diamonds have become scarce because of some high demand for them. And so the price goes up considerably. Are we saying the seller can essentially cancel the sale?
If, in fact, the price that he got was not fair at the moment that he got it,
Okay.
then yes, probably.
Yeah.
But it would have to be true that it was unfair at the time when he got it. It can't just be
Okay.
that the price changed later. But yes, this hypothetically, if you are an unscrupulous diamond seller and you think the price is going to go up, you could hedge your bets by undercharging a bit. Although you're gonna have to charge by 17%, which is not just a bit, but you could undercharge, and then that will give you the option forever to buy the diamonds back from this guy at the price that he paid you, and reverse the sale. My guess would be that it also depends on your being able to find the person, which in real life probably that's not forever. Although, I guess in a small town where people actually know each other and most people don't leave, maybe. I don't know. But it would definitely have to have been an unfair price at the time that you charged it. Okay, so because of Rav Nachman here, the case has to be the buyer rather than the seller in the second half of the Mishnah with Rabbi Tarfon. So that we say Ela Dizavin Shavek Kavdalid Betiltinu train. So it must be that we mean that he sold something that's worth 24 for the price of 32. Okay, so in the end, everything in our Mishnah can be read like Rav. That is to say that the fractions are fractions of the correct price. Everything in our Mishnah can probably also be read like Shmuel, but that's fine. That's how you get a dispute among later authorities, is that there's more than one possible interpretation of the older text. And then if there's more than one legitimate interpretation of the older text, you end up with a dispute. That's fine. Okay. But we also we're going to quote a Breita, which really just explicitly supports Shmuel. So Shmuel for sure has somebody to rely on. Rav is a possible interpretation of the Mishnah. Okay, Tanya Kavatei Shmuel. Here's the Breita that supports Shmuel. Mishahu talalav yado al ha'elyona. The person on whom the ona'ah was put, right, the victim of the ona'ah, has the upper hand. Ketzad, how does that work? So now we're going to get some pretty specific examples. Machar lo shaveh he bivav. If the seller sold him something that's worth 5 for 6, minit anet lokeach, who's the victim there? The victim is the buyer. Yad lokeach al ha'elyona, and therefore the buyer's hand is on top. Ratza omer tein li ma'otai, if he wants, he can say, give me my money. Oh, tein li mashe onetani, or you can say, just give me back the amount that you overcharged me. And well, okay, it's not over yet. Macharlo shaveh sheish b'chamesh. If he sold him something that's worth 6 for 5, minitane mocher. In that case, who is the victim? The victim is the seller, because the seller was supposed to get something 6 and he only got 5. Yad mochera ha'elyona. In that case, the hand of the seller is above. I mean, he has the upper hand. Ratza omer li tein li mikchi. If he wants, he can say, give me back my merchandise. Or, oh, tein li masha onetani, or he can say, give me the money that you cheated me from. So this Breita explicitly describes as ona'ah both a case where you charge 6 for something that was worth 5, and a case where you charge 5 for something that was worth 6. It seems like either a sixth of the price paid or a sixth of the correct price is called ona'ah in this Breita. Then that is exactly what Shmuel has been saying all along. Okay, so now having decided that Shmuel and Rav are both legitimate, they both have texts to rely on, we're moving on. We got a new question. Ibayalu. They had a question. Pachot mishtut l'Rabbanan la'altar havya mechila. So according to the rabbis, that is to say, the people at the beginning of the Mishnah who said that the fraction is 1/6, and that at least for ona'ah, the customer only has until they would have a chance to show it to somebody to find out how much it's worth if they want to bring it back and fix the price. According to that position in the first half of the Mishnah, suppose that the ona'ah or the error in the price was less than a sixth. So we said that we presume that is forgiven, meaning we presume that customers and sellers both allow for some error in numbers, and they if it's within a sixth of the right number, they say, yeah, well, whatever. That's the just what happens when you ask people to do math fast, and I don't mind so much. So the question is, at that less than a sixth point, does that forgiveness that we presume is happening, does that happen immediately? Or we just assume it happens if the person doesn't come back and complain after showing it to somebody, right? Do we have the same time constraint on that we had on ona'ah, or do we in fact just assume that you just don't have? We're not actually talking about forgiveness. What we're actually saying is you don't have a right to complain. Ever. Okay, so let's see if we can figure this out. But before we go to figure it out, we have another question. And even if you find a way to say that you have until you show it to somebody to come back and complain, even about these amounts that are less than a sixth, then in that case, ma'ika bein shtut lepachot mishtut. In that case, what would be the difference between a sixth and less than a sixth? Right? We're making a big fuss about this number, but if the law is effectively the same in both cases, that you take it home, you show it to your relatives, they tell you it's the wrong price, you go back, you complain, you get your money back. So what difference does it make whether it's a sixth or less than a sixth? Okay, so we're going to answer that question first, and then we're going to come back to the other question. The answer to the second question is Ika de ilu shtut yado al ha'elyona. Okay, there's a difference, because if it was exactly off by a sixth, then the victim has the upper hand. Ratzah chozer, ratzah koneh umachzir onah. If he wants, he can totally reverse the transaction. Or if he wants, he can just get the price fixed and get some of his money back, or get some more money from the other person, whatever it is that would be needed in order for the price to be correct. But the victim gets to make that choice if the price error is exactly a sixth. Ve'ilu pachot mishtut kanau machzir ona. However, if it's less than, the error is less than a sixth, then there's no decision to be made. The sale stands, and all you have the right to do is insist that the price be fixed. All right, that if you overpaid, you get a little bit of money back. If you undercharge, that you get a little bit more money, but you can't reverse the sale. The sale stands. Okay, so now back to our original question, which is this forgiveness that we're talking about with the smaller price errors. Is that automatic and immediate, or is it just something that happens, that we assume happens if the person doesn't come and complain after a period of time? So that's my, right? Let's going back to our question. So, Nu, what is the answer? Tashma. So we're going to quote something and see if it helps us figure it out. Chazru l'divrei chachamim. The end of our Mishnah, it said that the merchants in Lod went back to following the words of the rabbis. Meaning they went back to considering ona'ah to be 1/6 and to giving people only long enough to go show it to somebody before they had to come back and complain. Savruha pachot mishlish l'Rabbi Tarfon ki pachot mishtut l'Rabbanan. So our first attempt at reading this Mishnah, which we're going to reject this idea in a minute, but our initial attempt to understand what's going on involves assuming that according to Rabbi Tarfon, less than a third is the same thing as according to the rabbis, less than a sixth. Meaning that Rabbi Tarfon and the rabbis are saying exactly the same law, just with a different number. That's what we start out assuming. But that's not going to work. If you say this correctly, then pachot mishtut l'Rabbanan, less than a sixth for the rabbis, bichtei sheyir'eh l'tagar l'krovo. Then if the rabbis, if forgiveness is not automatic and you have until it's time and long enough to go show it to somebody, according to the rabbis, even if the price error is less than a sixth, and that same rule applies at less than a third for Rabbi Tarfon, meaning Rabbi Tarfon, if you have a price error less than a third, says that you have time to go decide whether you want to come back and demand that the price be fixed. But Rabbi Tarfon gives you a longer period of time. He gives you all day. In that case, Mishum Hachi Chazru, that's why the merchants went back to the rabbis, because that's a lot of uncertainty with their sales. It's very hard to do business if no sale is ever final until the end of the day. Right? How do you make any business decision if at any time all day anybody who bought anything from you could come back and demand that you change the price? So they would very much prefer to go back to, even though the rabbis gave them less flexibility about making price errors, at least the rabbis said, if you waited long enough that the guy could go home and talk to his family and come back to you, then you could assume he's not coming back. Whereas for Rabbi Tarfon, if you sold something at 7 o'clock in the morning, you can't assume that the sale is final until the sun sets, and that's a long time in the future. Okay, Ella, but but if we say that the rabbis at a price error of less than a sixth, the rabbis say that that's forgiven automatically, right? And so you can just assume that the money's yours because the other person isn't going to come back and get it if the mistake was less than a sixth. Ula Rabbi Tarfon nami la'alter havi mechila, and that if we assume that the same thing is true with Rabbi Tarfon, that if the price error was by less than a third, then you can just assume that the person doesn't mind and it's yours right away. In that case, Rabbi Tarfon, why in the world would the merchants reject Rabbi Tarfon? That's a pretty sweet deal. You can charge any amount you want, up to a third more than you were supposed to charge. And as soon as the person walks away with the merchandise in their hand and you're holding the money is yours to keep and they can't even complain. That sounds like a good enough deal that they should not have backed out of their relationship with Rabbi Tarfon. So nicha lehu tvei demai derabanan kamashvu lehu onaa l'Rabbi Tarfon havia mechila. Right? They should stick with Rabbi Tarfon. They should like Rabbi Tarfon, because sales that the rabbis are going to make them give back money on, Rabbi Tarfon is just letting them keep the money. Mi savrat pachot mi shalish. Up to this point, we seem to have proven that the Rabbi Tarfon story only makes sense if this forgiveness at less than ona'ah is not automatic, and you have until whatever the time limit is, you have that long to discover that you have even a small price error and come back and complain. And if you go past that point, then we assume that it was forgiven. But before that, not. We think at this point, it would seem that version of things makes Rabbi Tarfon's story make more sense. But now we've got a different way of reading the story, which will make that not necessarily true. Lo, mishtut v'ad shlish l'Rabbi Tarfon geshtut atzma l'Rabbananda. So remember that I said back at the beginning, when they said, to begin with, the rabbis assumed that the right way to understand the Mishnah was that the number 1/3 means to Rabbi Tarfon the same thing that the number 1/6 means to the rabbis. And I said we were going to reject that. So here we are rejecting that. And saying that, in fact, for Rabbi Tarfon, he is not saying that 1/3 is the limit of ona'ah, and anything below 1/3 is forgiven, and anything above 1/3 is canceled, the same way the rabbi said about 1/6. Instead, he is saying that anything between 1/6 and 1/3 is ona'ah. And then anything below 1/6 will be forgiven. Anything above 1/3 will be canceled. But Rabbi Tarfon would have this really big chunk of cases in the middle between 1/6 and 1/3, in which he's going to say, that's ona'ah, you have until my time limit to go home, show it to somebody, think about it, and come back and either reverse the transaction or get the price fixed. And in that case, just following it through, in that case, the merchants don't really gain that much from a switch to Rabbi Tarfon, because they're still only going to be able to presume that people are just sort of okay with being overcharged up to 1/6 more than they were supposed to be charged. And they are still at that, anything above that, they're still going to be subject to having to give people money back. So the Gemara says, in that case, if the limit on how much they're actually allowed to charge doesn't change, so why were they celebrating to begin with? Why do they care? Tifshot de bitul mikach l'Rabbanan le'olam chozer. So let's say that maybe the rabbis think that we said that if you charge a price error that's more than ona'ah, which for the rabbis is 1/6, that is called cancellation, and the sale just doesn't work, and you can exchange, you have to just exchange the money and the stuff back and start over again. So let's try to resolve this by saying maybe the rabbis think that there's no time limit on that. You can go, if the overcharge was more than 1/6, you can insist on reversing the transaction forever. And in that case, the Kevan de Amar Lahu Rabbi Tarfon Hevya Ona Samchu. So in that case, an overcharge between a sixth and a third, the rabbis would give you eternity to come back and complain and demand your money back. And Rabbi Tarfon would say, oh no, that just looks like normal ona'at to me. You have until the end of the day, and then at the end of the day, I presume that you don't care, and we all move on. So then the merchants are happy because I guess enough of their cases of overcharging are between a third and a sixth, between a sixth and a third, that they would be pleased by having a time limit imposed on people coming back for returns on those sales. Second. Okay. And then ki amar lehu kol hayom chazru. And then when he told them, well, there's a limit on how long those people can come back and return their stuff, but that limit is all day, then they said, you know what, never mind, this isn't really enough better. We're going back to the rabbis. Because if you think that the rabbis think a cancellation of a purchase for like huge overcharging can only happen long enough to show it to a relative or a merchant, in that case, in that case, what are the merchants celebrating about? Because there's already this limit on people's returning stuff, so who cares? In that case, maybe maybe they're celebrating because at exactly a sixth, the Rabbi Tarfon Mechila ula Rabbanan Ona, because at exactly a sixth, the rabbis think that that's Ona'ah, and that you have until you could go show it to somebody to come back and come back and demand your money back. And Rabbi Tarfon at that level says it's just forgiven, right? Like if it's exactly a sixth, he says that's not a big enough price difference for anyone to care about. And so what we have at the end here, in effect, is that you can read this part of the Mishnah both ways, right? We have not resolved anything. You could read it either with having a time limit on when the money gets forgiven, or with not having a time limit on when the money gets forgiven. It's going to give you different results in some of the other parts of the Mishnah, but we did have a coherent reading for both, so you cannot resolve our question by reading our Mishnah. Okay, so now we have a new question, which we will deal with briefly, and then we'll be done for tonight. Ibayalu, new question. Bitul mikach l'rabanan le'olam chazeh. So, although this is not exactly a new question because we did touch on it for a second ago, when the price is more than ona'ah and therefore it is canceled, do the rabbis think there's a time limit on that cancellation? Meaning, can you come back 5 years later and say you charged me more than ona'ah for this and I want my money back? Or maybe you only have long enough to go show it as usual to a merchant or to a relative. And even if you say that you only have long enough to show it to a merchant or a relative, in that case, I have another question, which is ma'ika ben shtut liyetzer al shtut. If you're time limited in the same way as you would be at exactly a sixth, then what difference does it make whether it's exactly a sixth or whether it's more than a sixth? Well, that question we can answer. Ika, we do have a difference. The ilu shtut mishanit anech, because if it was exactly a sixth, then only the victim can return, can go back. The ilu yeter al shtut shnehem chosrim. But if it's more, the mistake is by more than a sixth, then both of them would be allowed to go back, even if we time limit it. Okay, at that point, the Gemara then says, okay, fine, now let's go back and discuss our question, but we are going to leave that for next week because that's the amount that fits into 45 minutes. Okay, that is what I have for you this evening. Are there questions? Yes, John.
Imagining the following situation. You've purchased a raw diamond and you bring it to a jeweler to cut it or carve it or whatever is the correct term, and they discover that there was a non-visible major flaw, so that the item is worth just a small fraction of what you paid for it. Is that covered in this case, or because when you purchase it, you thought the price was fair. The seller thought the diamond was in reasonable shape, and now one learns that it's very different.
My guess would be that if it's the kind of flaw that was definitely always there, that yes, that would be covered by this. And in a diamond, that's probably true. In a lot of other kinds of merchandise, there's going to be some room for interpretation as to when the flaw appeared. And then I think you'd have to be able to prove that it was already flawed when you bought it.
Well, actually, I could imagine with an uncut diamond that the flaw occurred with the stone cutter working on it.
Yeah. So then I don't know very much about diamonds, but I would guess that if the seller has space to say it was fine when I sold it to you and you broke it, then that's going to be an acceptable claim unless we have proof that it's not true. Because in general, we have a principle, that if you're trying to take money away from somebody else, you have to prove that it's yours. So the burden of proof is basically always on the person who's not currently holding the money. That does produce some weird situations in which sometimes if you reach across the counter and grab the money, now the burden of proof is on the other guy. And that is not actually good for society, right? Like, we don't want to live in the kind of society where the incentive is to punch the other guy in the nose and take his wallet. That's bad. But in general, the putting the burden of proof on the person who's trying to take someone else's stuff is the right way to go. So I don't know anything about diamonds, but that's the best I can do to answer the question. Any other questions? Okay, I believe I will see you next Monday night. Have a lovely evening and a great week.